Good day and welcome to CSIS. My name is Joseph Majkut and I'm the director of our Energy Security and Climate Change program. I have an exciting conversation for you today about the role of hydrogen in helping us achieve a decarbonized future, what the opportunities for this new technology are. While it's still nascent, we're going to make significant investments here in the United States, and countries around the world are making significant investments themselves to try and capture both a brand new marketplace as well as reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. But I think there are going to be some risks to using this new technology too, and hopefully we'll be able to touch on those as well. Our program today is slightly shorter than we anticipated. One guest, Melanie Kenderdine, is unable to make it because of transportation and logistics challenges. We're all learning how to be back amongst each other. We miss Melanie, and it's too bad we don't have her. That does mean, however, that we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end of our session. If you want to reach out to me, you're watching the live stream. I think the fastest way to do that will be via Twitter, at Joseph Majkut, JOSEPHMAJKUT. I'll be able to respond to questions that are asked, or tag me and I'll be able to get to your questions. We still have a great program for you today. We've got two real experts in this space from the private sector as well as from civil society. Steve Hamburg is the chief scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund, and Ben Wilson is a vice president at National Grid. We're going to start with Steve. And Steve, if you can give us just some opening remarks on the role that you see hydrogen could play in decarbonization, where it's going to be most important, and also explaining some of the work you've done trying to highlight how we need to make sure we do this in the right way. Thank you and welcome to CSIS.
Thanks, great to be here. And so, as you mentioned, we have a challenge globally in addressing the climate crisis of really needing to decarbonize our energy system. And to do that, we need to use a myriad of different tools. And the challenge we have is everybody thinks appropriately about renewables, about solar and wind, hydro, nuclear, which is not a renewable, but is clean energy, whatever. But we're not going to be able to use those to meet all of our needs. And that's where we need to look to hydrogen. So what are those sectors where we don't have good alternatives? Things like steel making and cement production, where hydrogen offers currently a path towards a greatly reduced carbon footprint for those productions. And hydrogen allows us to meet the energy needs in those sectors. But we also have to remember that hydrogen isn't a universal solution to all of our energy problems. Often it's tagged as a zero emissions fuel, and so it's sort of kind of a free ride relative to decarbonization, and that in fact is not true. It takes a lot of energy to produce hydrogen, whether that's green hydrogen from water through electrolysis, or blue hydrogen from natural gas with combined with carbon capture and storage. So that energy that's required to produce it is an added input, and we have to make sure that we don't use hydrogen where we could directly use the electricity, for example, that could produce renewable directly, because for example, in homes or in our commercial sector, if we use electricity directly, we can decarbonize many times more of that infrastructure or those needs than we can if we just use hydrogen. So we have that issue to worry about. How do we maximize the rate of decarbonization across all the sectors? So that's the first issue we got to do. And hydrogen can play a role, but only in some areas. Other places it's going to be less effective. The other thing is that hydrogen's a potent indirect greenhouse gas. So what do I mean by an indirect greenhouse gas? It means that while it itself does not cause climate change, when hydrogen is released to the atmosphere, it causes reactions in the atmosphere that increase other greenhouse gases, causing the retention of heat. And so we have to be really careful that we don't use hydrogen in places and in ways that it's going to get lost, it's going to be emitted to the atmosphere. And the other thing is hydrogen is the smallest molecule. It's referred to as really slippery. So it's really hard to hold on to hydrogen. If we have trouble holding on to natural gas, which we do, so we really have a lot of emissions associated with our natural gas supply chain, hydrogen is going to leak even more and emitted more. So on a sort of physical basis, it could be emitted 3 times more than methane. So the challenge we have is figuring out where we really need hydrogen to reach decarbonization, where it's really optimal, and which environments in which hydrogen will slow us down, and the places in between where it's not so clear. And wherever we use it, we need to make sure that we develop the procedures for really doing it without much emissions. The challenge we have today is we are not able to measure those hydrogen emissions. We do not have the technology, the instrumentation to actually measure the quantity of methane hydrogen that's being emitted to the atmosphere. Now that hopefully is going to change very quickly, but in the absence of data right now, we're all speculating. And if we do have higher hydrogen emission rates, it could greatly undercut the net climate benefits. It could even cause more climate warming if we have high emission rates, if we use blue hydrogen over several decades than if we simply use the existing fossil fuels. That doesn't mean we shouldn't use hydrogen. We just need to make sure we use it in the right place under the right conditions.
Thank you very much, Steve. Lots to follow up there, but let's let Ben have a chance. Ben, for the benefit of our audience who may not know, a brief description of National Grid, your operations, and your view on hydrogen.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. And it's great to be here with the CSIS. So Ben Wilson, Chief Strategy and External Affairs Officer for National Grid. So we're a very large, sort of $40–50 billion investor-owned utility, UK-US. So we're roughly 50–50 UK-US. And here in the US, we operate in New York State and in Massachusetts. And our operations in the US are roughly equal electricity distribution networks and gas distribution networks. In the UK, we're now almost entirely an electric company. So overall, we're sort of 70% electric, 30% gas. We are, as you would expect for a European company, frankly, super committed to net zero. So we have public targets which get us to net zero scope 1, 2, and 3 by 2050, if not before. And we have a series of milestones that we've set out along the way. We're going through a process at the moment with the Science Based Targets Institute to get accreditation for our pathways in line with no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming. So if we achieve that, and we're making good progress, that will put us very much in the front line of utilities to get that accreditation. A really important element of that is how we decarbonize our public gas networks in New York and Massachusetts. Now, electrification will be a part of that, but we actually think, to Stephen's point, the quickest route is what we're all looking for here, but also balanced against practicality and affordability. And this is often a light bulb moment for people coming to this fresh. The difficulty of decarbonizing domestic heat, which is what the gas networks do, right, is the scale of it in energy terms. Typically, the gas networks deliver 2–3 times, sometimes more energy than the electric networks. The average household receives a lot more energy through the gas network, the electric network. Now, if we move from gas heating to air source heat pump heating, for example, those devices are much more efficient. So the amount of energy required, as Stephen says, if you go all electric, is much less. But still, you're looking at a very significant increase in load on the electric networks. Mm-hmm. That has a number of implications. It means a lot of reinforcement is required on the grid, and it's hard enough already to get permitting for new transmission lines and so on. We see that's a real-world situation we're dealing with in our states. To put that on top, the extra requirements are very difficult. It pushes up bills. So at system level, it pushes up bills. And the other thing we're very conscious of, we operate the vast majority of the transmission system in the UK. We're the grid operator. We're very, very focused on balancing and integrating renewables. And clearly the long duration storage issue is still an issue for a very high renewables penetration electricity system. If you try to electrify heat solely, you just make that challenge larger, right? So there are electricity system scale challenges from 100% electrification strategy. Also for householders, there are significant challenges. The cost of converting a house to electric heating can be $20,000 or more. Many of the older housing stock, poorly insulated, multi-occupancy housing stock, it's pretty hard to convert to electric, particularly in built-up areas in New York City where we operate. So you face considerable disruption for the population. So our strategy for our gas networks, we call it a hybrid strategy. It's got 4 elements. The first one is energy efficiency. I mean, that is just a no-brainer under any circumstance. And we have a whole bunch of incentive and grant programs available for our customers on that. So energy efficiency. The second one is that between now and 2050, we will progressively decarbonize 100% of the gas that we deliver through our networks. Initially, mostly with renewable natural gas, but then increasingly over time with green hydrogen. And our strategy in the Northeast is a green hydrogen strategy, mainly because there's no legacy gas production. There are no geologic storage facilities for CCS in our part of the country. So it's a green hydrogen strategy that we pursue. So decarbonize gas. The third element of our strategy is what we call hybrid heating. We forecast that by 2050, probably 75% of our customers will have an air source heat pump. But probably 50% of them will also have still gas heating, now powered by decarbonised gas, to top up. Because air source heat pumps, particularly if you've got an old legacy housing stock, will struggle when it's really, really cold, right, when there's snow on the ground. And then the last element is targeted electrification, and also some network geothermal ground source heat pump. We think that is an important solution. We think we need multiple vectors. Again, it's important to remember, particularly with green hydrogen, hydrogen is not a primary source of energy. Neither is electricity, right? They're both just delivery mechanisms. And for the reasons I've outlined, system scale and in the household, having a couple of delivery mechanisms rather than just one, we think is just a much more practical and faster and more affordable way to make the transition. Importantly, we're not making anyone do anything. Right? If you want to go all electric, you can. There's nothing stopping you. But actually, if that is a difficult option for you, then this provides an alternative scenario. Agree with all the points that have been made around the importance of leakage. In our system increasingly now is plastic pipes, the distribution system. We're replacing the old cast iron for safety reasons. We should be at a small single-digit percentage leakage. Typically, you're sort of 2-3% maximum leakage rates for a modern distribution system. And if it's green hydrogen produced close to the customer, we shouldn't have, there's no gas gathering, there's no transmission with venting. It should be a much more manageable problem. Completely agree. We don't want to go from one solution to a new solution and create, significant atmospheric issues.
So give us just a picture on what does it look like to decarbonize a gas system? Because I'm not sure that everybody who is viewing sort of knows what that process looks like over the next 10 to 20 years. And then we can kind of think about how does that relate to both the challenges and the benefits that you raised.
So the milestones we've set out, by 2025, so 3 years from now, we want about 3% of our volumes to be coming from renewable natural gas. So this is methane, just like natural gas, coming from landfill and also from agricultural waste. So you've got to get the accounting right. What we won't do is do energy crops, by the way, because that creates other problems elsewhere in the economy. If that methane that we capture and put into the gas pipelines and then consume in the home, if that was going to be flared or burned on site, then it's kind of CO2 neutral. If it was going to be fugitive emissions in the form of methane, if we hadn't have captured it and burned it, arguably it's CO2 negative, actually. So 3% by 2025. That's a small percentage, but it's starting. 10% by 2030. Then we'll also be having a little bit of green hydrogen coming by that date. And our plan, we back end the hydrogen because we're trying to be conservative. And the RNG is more implementable today. Mm-hmm. To be fair, though, that was before the Inflation Reduction Act. Right. And that is going to have a massive impact, I think, on the prospectivity of hydrogen and the evolution of the hydrogen economy here in the United States. So it may well be that we're conservative on when hydrogen comes in. So we'll be blending in, increasing volumes of RNG. In the 2030s, there'll be increasing volumes of green hydrogen. And at some point, and in parts of the network, we'll hit what we call the blend wall, which is about 20% hydrogen by volume. It's about 6 or 7% by energy. Up to that level, you can blend hydrogen into the system, and the appliances, customer appliances, can cope with that blend. The limiting factor for the hydrogen blend is generally the appliances and the meters, not the pipes themselves. At distribution level, it's a bit different at transmission. So we go up to the blend wall. That's a lot of hydrogen, right? That creates a lot of demand for and helps catalyze hydrogen supply. If we want to go beyond the blend wall, then the precedent for that is when we converted from manufactured gas to natural gas back in the 60s and 70s. And ironically, manufactured gas was about 50, 60% hydrogen, just made from coal in a gas works with a lot of CO2. But we've been there before, actually, in terms of reticulating large volumes of hydrogen. And in a way, this is sort of back to the future. When we want to go beyond the blend wall, we will have to adjust appliances for that. And so what we think would be a really smart future-proofing thing to do would be to say, as soon as possible, within the next 5 years, all new appliances need to be hydrogen ready, i.e. capable of conversion to hydrogen burning. That way, when we start going beyond the blend wall in, let's say, the late 2030s, it's a visit by the engineer to your home. It's 1 hour in the home, no more than 10-15% of the original cost of the appliance, and probably that would be socialized anyway through bills. And then that is going to be a lot easier than having to reinstall new appliances. So those are some of the things that we want to see. If we plan ahead, we can make this relatively seamless. That concept of hydrogen-ready appliances is well underway in the UK, and the two major boiler manufacturers in the UK now have hydrogen boilers, hydrogen-ready boilers. Interesting, they're actually a hydrogen boiler backfitted to burn natural gas. So if we start making some of those plans, we can make this transition reasonably seamless. I say again, we're still going to see a lot of people going electric, but I think we need more than one tool in the toolbox here.
So one more question for Ben, then I want to go to Steve. But you mentioned affordability in your opening remarks as being a key element that your company's looking at.
Yeah.
If I dig into the literature that makes economic analysis of where is hydrogen best going to be used, home heating, utility services are not the places where you see that because hydrogen tends to be expensive. What's the outlook on that question now in the United States post-IRA, where we have what I perceive to be quite large subsidies for the creation of green hydrogen or very low emissions hydrogen?
Yes. So I think I've seen a bunch of analysis which I think we would support, which suggests by 2030, after IRA subsidies, we're looking at sort of $8 to $9 an MMBTU for green hydrogen. The $3 a kilogram tax credit, that's like $20 an MMBTU, right? So this is significant support. Natural gas prices have been rising, and importantly also, you've got to compare it to delivered prices, not to Henry Hub prices. You've got to have the cost of transportation. And again, the nice thing about green hydrogen is it could most likely be produced on a distributed basis where you want it. And so you get a real significant benefit there, and that of course will also help with leaks. If we're not if we're bringing the electricity to the electrolyzer, and then having the electrolyzer where it's convenient for water and for injection into the gas networks, then we help too. So I think with the IRA, and then unfortunately, if you like, with the rising price of natural gas because of what's going on in the world with Ukraine and so on, right. I think we'll see those two converging by the end of the 2030s, by the end of the 2020s, by about 2030.
Interesting. Steve, what's your, you made the case we should be looking for the places where we can get the most rapid decarbonization. But the U.S.'s strategy on climate has really evolved, right? And one of the things we're looking at now is market formation, the building of a lot of infrastructure that can provide low carbon services. Does that change how you think about where hydrogen should be used and how it should be used in the medium term, if not the long term?
Well, I really don't think it does, in the sense that I think Ben's outlining a strategy that I think will not actually meet the climate objectives that are actually required by law in New York and Massachusetts. And I was a National Grid customer till not recently when they sold off their Rhode Island business. I live in an old house, and so I know very well. And we also know that we have the lowest capacity to create renewable energy in the region. So there's a limited amount of renewable energy, and one of the leakiest systems. So we have actually the best data on methane emissions from any city in the world is Boston. And if we just look at what's currently occurring, and we can't balance it, so it's not just from pipes. Every house, appliance, So you add in hydrogen, we have no clue what the implications of putting hydrogen in all these appliances is. We can't even explain current methane. So the net climate benefits of the strategy that Ben outlined is going to be significantly less than he articulates. And given that we are going to have limited renewable energy in the region, and we're trying to build it out as quickly as we can, but it's not so simple. You've got to go offshore, deep offshore. As anybody who lives in the region know, it's been challenging, right? Bringing in Hydro-Quebec, that has its own greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. So you put all that together, using that electricity to produce green hydrogen will not create a path to maximum decarbonization. And the pipes that are currently in the ground, there's a lot of, as I said, a lot of it is old. Rather than spending millions of dollars per mile to replace that, and there's still a lot of pipe need to replace, and National Grid has been working on that. But rather than doing that, we need to fix those leaks and retire most of those pipes and put that capital into electrifying houses. Because to be honest, in the region, you can electrify most of these houses. It isn't a hard thing to do. Yes, you have to build more capacity and transmission. You can also bury high voltage DC lines. While it is an additional cost, it can be done. We really need to think out of the box and not use, just because we have existing infrastructure, use that and assume that that's the best path forward. For the local distribution to the houses in these older neighborhoods, and I always kid that I live in a new neighborhood in Providence and my house is 120 years old. When I go home tonight and walk from the train station home, I'll be going, less and less old houses from 300 and some years old. You can electrify those houses. Yes, it requires a little more complexity. I live in a historic district. I have heat pumps in my house. It was not that hard to do. It does require effort. But if I think about, National Grid replaced the natural gas pipe in front of my house. It was 100 and plus years old when it was done. The several $million per mile, is that really the approach that we need, given we need the capital to electrify, and we're going to have limited? I think if we go to first principles, so if we take the strategy Ben articulated, we could expect to see between now and 2050 that only roughly, if we're lucky, a 50% reduction in the net radiative forcing from that employing that green hydrogen, as opposed to a close to 100% reduction if we went with electrification. We can't afford that additional carbon footprint. The same thing with renewable methane. We have to be very careful with ag waste, because if you emit any methane emissions, and creating that methane from the ag waste can often lead to a lot of emissions. So we really have to look at the full implications. Again, that's not to say hydrogen doesn't have a role to play, but in the Northeast in particular, it's going to be less than in some of the industrial hub zones.
Yeah, I hear that. I still think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my vision for the next few years under IRA is we're going to be able to, like when we talk to potential producers, we're going to have a lot of hydrogen. My belief is we're going to be looking for places to put it.
We have almost no green hydrogen or even blue hydrogen right now.
Right.
So yes, we're going to have more hydrogen. We have enormous need in the industrial sector. Why wouldn't we use that hydrogen where we need it the most to be able to rapidly decarbonize, not to actually take a slower path to decarbonization? So we really need to be strategic in thinking about how to use hydrogen. We don't know how to manage it on the scales we're talking about. We have literally no data on leakage and emissions associated with deployment of that hydrogen. We really need to learn how to do it. So let's work through the problems in places where we kind of have good understanding that these are really good, useful applications of hydrogen, and not put it in places where we know the challenges will be enormous. After a lot of work, we can't explain where all the methane's coming out of the natural gas system in our current systems. And if throughout the Northeast, the amount of methane being emitted in the urban environment is tremendous, and it will greatly, if we just replace hydrogen for natural gas with those systems right now, you will not see much of a decarbonization benefit. You will see a benefit if it's green, but then if you would have alternatively used that renewable energy to electrify, you would have much greater decarbonization. over the next 15 years.
So Ben, what's your thoughts on, one, market formation, and two, this question of infrastructure and the methane? Well, I think Steve makes a great point. If we can't close the methane budget now on existing infrastructure, what are we going to do to make sure that we don't recreate the same mistake with hydrogen?
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of things in that, and I'll come back to so our strategy is a green hydrogen strategy, right?
Right.
That's what we're pursuing. So it all starts with renewables. It doesn't matter whether we deliver that energy to the home via electrons or via hydrogen. It's all coming from renewables. The thing about hydrogen is it doesn't matter what time of day we produce it. We are going to have a lot of offshore wind in the northeast, and we're playing our part in that. So we've just bought into the largest offshore lease in New York Bight alongside RWE, and we'll be developing probably about 3.5 gigawatts of offshore wind as part of that project. Once offshore wind becomes a large proportion of peak demand, by definition, it is going to be in surplus off-peak. So it'll either be getting a very low price or it'll be constrained off. If we make hydrogen off-peak from that offshore wind, then that's a good use of that energy, which might be spilled otherwise. And it also helps the marginal economics of those offshore wind farms. At some point, we're going to need hydrogen to make the business case for incremental renewables. So it's not like sort of hydrogen is reducing the amount of renewable energy available for other sources. Hydrogen supports it. It's an additional revenue stream for renewables. This is a real point. We talk to renewable developers, and they see hydrogen going forward as an important part of their business case for projects. Deals with itself on peak, off peak. And indeed, our modeling, this is all in our plan, it shows that under an all electrification scenario in the Northeast versus our hybrid scenario, which still has a lot of electrification in it, peak electricity demand, peak renewables demand is lower in the hydrogen scenario, in the mixed scenario, even though the efficiency is lower because you don't have to build to peak, whereas with an electricity system, you kind of have to build to peak. So there's I don't see any kind of rationing issue or choice between, what are we going to do with it? It's simply another delivery mechanism. It catalyzes more renewables. In terms of market formation, so I joined Grid a year ago. I spent the prior 7 years in Australia. And in Australia, we were pretty early to come out with a hydrogen strategy. And one of the reasons why that really caught on, and it became very widely supported, bipartisan support in Australia, was because of the prospectivity of hydrogen as an export industry for Australia. The Koreans and the Japanese today buy a lot of coal, natural gas, and other things from Australia. And they're saying to Australia, we actually want to decarbonize. We want a future energy system, which is basically nuclear, renewables, and gas turbines. But the gas turbines will be hydrogen. That's their vision. Right. And Australia, we see you as you've got all this solar, you know how to liquefy gas, put it on ships, you're a trusted partner. We see you as the right people to do that. And when we thought about the route to market for that, the beauty of blending into the gas networks is it is the one use case which gets around the chicken and egg situation today. Today, there's not much demand for green hydrogen because there isn't any supply, and vice versa. You can blend up to the blend wall, and that's a lot of hydrogen, into the gas networks. Customers don't have to do anything different, and you create the industry. So the commercialization pathway we saw in Australia was domestic gas blending, other domestic use cases, and then export, and you scale up like that. So we implemented small, but the time was significant, 1.25 megawatts Siemens PEM electrolyzer in South Australia, in Adelaide. We built that project with a base use case of blending into the local gas network. Once the project was sanctioned, suddenly BOC comes to us, the industrial gases company, and they say, well, actually, you know what? We'd like to take some of your green hydrogen, displace the grey hydrogen we're using in the steelworks for argon production, and we'll take it from you now that you're there. But that never would have stood the project up, because it never would have been an anchor use case. We had the state government then come to us saying, well, now you've got that, we'd like to do some hydrogen buses. Now you've got a production source. So it's a great way, actually, to kickstart the market. If you blend green hydrogen into the gas network, you turn the gas network into a giant battery, essentially, for renewable power. You can produce it off-peak, put it in the gas network, and then use it at peak time when people need it.
Yeah. I'm going to push back a little that in the sense that I agree with Ben that you don't want to have to use 100% renewables. We're complete agreement, but there are multiple strategies for addressing that. And we really need to create the minimum cost systems. So we did this work, work across models looking at that in California. And in fact, putting the hydrogen in the pipe is probably not the solution that comes through. There are multiple ways of doing it, but putting it in the local pipe is really does not make sense on first principles. Don't put something that's really hard to hold in a pipe, in people's houses, where we know there's a lot of leakage, and that leakage matters, and it's going to be very high capital costs. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. There are other ways to balance I completely agree with Ben, you need to create these markets, but we should be making that demand where it's going to be useful. So for example, in transport, we have to be really careful because we don't know a thing about the net benefits from the climate standpoint. We do know for CNG and LNG that it's really hard to hold it in a vehicle and it leaks. And there's every reason to believe it's going to be worse for large vehicles. We don't have that data yet. Nobody does. So we really have to understand that before we start making those major investments so that we really can understand what we're going to get into. And the similar thing, we're seeing a lot less interest in moving large quantities of hydrogen around. People are really talking about going to ammonia because it's really difficult to do. It's not very energy dense. And so you've got to liquid off, you've got boil off problems, you've got a whole series of issues that haven't been resolved. So I think we have to be careful of not getting ahead of ourselves and really looking at first principles, using hydrogen where it really can be effective, developing the kinds of systems that Ben refers to, but not locking in with a single strategy, but recognizing there are multiple approaches to doing that, and that those multiple approaches need to be looked at. So doing demonstration projects, no problem. Absolutely, let's do it. But let's not say we have a solution, we know how to do it using the existing local distribution or other things. We really need to explore that.
Yeah,
Pick the low-hanging fruit in the industry first.
And Ben, I'm interested in your thoughts on that, on the infrastructure question. I mean, you mentioned earlier, okay, stuff that's hydrogen ready, which is this keyword in hydrogen discussions that I'm not sure a lot of people know what is always meant. I think people mean different things when they say it. So you also said that you feel confident that you would see leakage rates in single-digit percentages, right?
Yes,
and
single-digit.
So
on the network, yeah.
What gives you that over the network? Excuse me. So what gives you the confidence, and what would give you pause as you start building or start operating? That was not working, right? How would we monitor that? How would we track it?
Yeah, sure. So I think what's important is we're not proposing to do any blending in parts of the network which are still old and leaky, right? The old cast iron pipe. This goes hand in hand with what we call our leak-prone pipe replacement, which Stephen referred to. We had been doing in Rhode Island. We're still doing in Massachusetts and New York. I think also, unfortunately, we have to keep coming back to the kind of real-world constraints that we face. And the reality is, we are going to have the gas networks for several decades still, whether we like it or not. We will, because you cannot move millions of customers off in a short period of time. And as long as there are any customers on it, you can't decommission those pipes. So, and those leak-prone pipe replacements are safety-driven. Mm-hmm. And actually, when we talk to our regulators, they are very keen. Our regulators and policymakers in New York and Massachusetts are very keen for decarbonisation. They're also very keen for those safety-related programs to continue. So we will be replacing pipe, for many decades. The networks will be there for many decades. Those areas of the pipe network which have then been upgraded to modern polyethylene pipe, we're looking at very low percentage leak rates. I've got to be careful here because I'm not a scientist. Stephen is a scientist. There's certainly the academic studies and testing that we've seen. Leak rates through PE, because it is a smaller molecule, are a bit higher than natural gas, but you're looking at a very small difference. And importantly, the leaks don't come through diffusion through the pipes. They come from joints and faults and meters and things like that. Stephen was talking a lot about emissions in the home. I can't comment on that. That's not something I'm familiar with. So Stephen may well be, Dallas is correct on that. But in terms of the gas network itself, you're looking at it's a high performance network once it's been replaced and upgraded.
Steve, you wrote this paper a couple months ago now on the warming effect of hydrogen. I think it would be really good for you to give us just the sort of high-level description of that paper and its findings. In particular, why be concerned about hydrogen as a warming gas, and why is it that you think it's important that we rate it on a relatively shorter time scale than we do CO2?
Well, so first of all, we don't rate CO2. It's relative to 100 years. So I just correct you there. What is our policy objective? So if we're talking about trying to basically zero out our emissions by 2050 to reach whether it's 2 degrees or 1.5, we need to get to net zero. Not in 100 years. We need to do that by 2050, roughly in 30 years. So don't do your calculation assuming you've got 100 years. Do your calculation assuming you have 30 years. That's all we say in the paper. So pick your policy objective and do your analytics accordingly. And so when you do that, what you see is that hydrogen over a 20-year period is about roughly 33 times CO2 in terms of its net radiative forcing impacts. Again, indirectly. It's not from hydrogen itself, but it's the reactions it causes. There's some uncertainty around that, and the modeling community is working on that, and we'll get that more refined. But that means that if you're emitting that hydrogen along the way, it does have a serious impact on the net decarbonization, not the CO2, but on the net decarbonization when you think about it as its effect on the climate. So what we have to worry about is places we're going to emit a lot. If we can keep it below 1%, we're probably good as we start rising. So for example, the data in Boston shows, and this includes a lot of plastic pipe, right? So Boston on average has 4+% of methane emitted just from that distribution system and its use, its value chain, okay? That's not largely just from the leak-prone pipe, the cast iron, and the bare steel that Ben talks about, which is clearly a problem, but we have also mapped those emissions and quantified them in Boston, and they can be minimized. Now, natural grid could easily reduce that dramatically within those because you can identify where they are and you can actually fix those independent of replacing the pipe. But it's coming from all kinds of places, right? It's not just from the pipes. At least half of that is coming from the houses and the uses. So we have, and when you put hydrogen in, that number will go up. It has to, based on first principles in physics. How much, we don't know because we haven't been able to make those measurements. So what we want to think about is if we produce hydrogen, what are the net radiative forcing implications? And that's what we did in these calculations over time. If we're only worried about 200 years from now, then okay, this is an issue we don't have to think too much about. But I don't think that's really what we're worried about. We are worried about that, but we worry about the near term as well. So when we do that, what we have to recognize is what are our alternative strategies for using the renewable energy, for balancing the system. Yes, you're going to have loads that are going to vary over time, but you can do different things with that power and not think about it as one solution, but really do the comparison across the systems level characteristics. And when you do it as a systems level problem, and you don't constrain it that you have to use the local distribution pipes or something else, what you find is you can actually keep costs constant with today's levels. At least we showed that quite dramatically in California. But you have multiple options within it. And we have to think about that rather than racing forward and saying that the local distribution pipes and putting hydrogen is the solution. I don't think we know that, and I think on first principles it's highly unlikely that in fact will be the case.
So we've gotten some actually really good questions from Twitter, so thank you to the audience, and maybe we could go for 5 extra minutes if you two don't mind, because this has been a really rich discussion. But I want to talk about energy security just for a moment.
Yeah.
In Europe, we're seeing a lot of companies and energy planners thinking through, okay, how do we get off Russian gas, and what role will hydrogen play in that context? The Northeast in the United States also suffers energy security challenges related to the supply of natural gas. It's been hard, as Ben said, to build in enough renewables resources as well. So, how should we think about, or how are companies thinking about hydrogen and even potential redundancy in the context of energy security?
Yeah, sure. I'll take that. Just to respond to a couple of points that were just made, because again, there were a few things in that. We've got to make sure that we don't make perfect the enemy of good here. There was also a reference to California. Electrifying the gas system in California and the Northeast are two completely different things because of the climate and the volume of gas. So I think that's an important point to note. I think on the, and the other point I would make is the focus is all here on the relative impact of fugitive emissions of hydrogen versus methane versus then electricity where there aren't any. But don't forget, most of the emissions from a natural gas system come from combustion, and that's gone, right, with the green hydrogen. So let's think about what the counterfactual is. And if you accept my premise, which is that actually, it is a lot of electrification is very hard and therefore happens later at great expense and with mixed consent from the population. If we can get good a lot sooner than we would have got perfect, then actually this can help. And importantly, this is all about choice, right? Ultimately, all we're saying is give it a go, the market will decide. If we felt that electrification was the no-brainer in all scenarios, we would do it, because we are 70% an electric company. We love electricity, we love electrification. We thought that was the best thing to do in all circumstances. That's what we would push. So just make those points. On energy security, what role can hydrogen play? Look, it is challenging. I mean, I'm a fan of hydrogen in some circumstances, but again, if we think about green hydrogen, it all comes from renewables. So, what benefit does a hydrogen system, the hydrogen delivery mechanism for security of supply compared to an electric delivery system? It gives you that resilience in terms of storms and weather because you're using an underground delivery system. You've got built-in storage. So you have that sort of intraday, a few days, weeks storage. Maybe in the future, if we've got very large hydrogen storage facilities in the way that we have gas storage facilities, it can give you, a month or so. But if you take the European situation where it's really about supply constraints, whether we go down the hydrogen route or electricity route, we just need to build lots and lots of renewables as quickly as possible.
Right.
And it's no surprise, therefore, you see the British government and a lot of the continental European governments upping their renewables targets in response to the war. Really, in Europe, the long-term solution is to reduce our natural gas consumption. Right, more renewables is what we need.
Sorry, I would completely agree with that. And just thinking about, I agree with Ben, that thinking about hydrogen as a storage system is definitely something we want to do, right? That's a higher use. So you say, how much can we store? We can test that, make sure we can do it. And then, but is it to put it in a pipe to send to a house, or is it to put it into a power facility to create the electricity that goes to the house? So I think it's different. So we do need to have those buffers. I completely agree. We also need a lot of short-term batteries. That technology exists. That is being built out. That helps you balance the load again, so you don't get these peak problems and needing to ground a lot of electricity. But that's the systems level, right? And we need to take responsibility for looking at that entire system, ensuring that we can maximize the rate of decarbonization, minimize the costs, and ensure there's equity we go along.
Question to both of you, and I'm sure that you've already pondered this. You might not be ready to answer it yet, but the DOE has just released a draft national hydrogen strategy, and a call for proposals for the national hydrogen hubs, the regional clean hydrogen innovation hubs. Do you have a response to what you've seen so far on either of those fronts?
I'm happy to go first. So National Grid is a partner in the Northeast Hydrogen Hub, which is being coordinated by NYSERDA out of New York. And we're very excited about that. And we see ourselves playing really throughout the value chain. So we do see our offshore wind and other offshore wind developments being an important off-peak production source for hydrogen, and we think it helps the offshore wind economics in the way that I've mentioned. We have obviously our gas networks, as I've discussed, which we think is a really good anchor use case. We also have a bunch of gas-powered generation on Long Island, which is contracted to the Long Island Power Authority. And that gas generation is necessary to meet demand on Long Island. but we need to decarbonize it. We think there's good prospectivity for it, and that'll increasingly move into the peak load, those generators on Long Island. We think they can be repowered to hydrogen. We think that's quite a good way. And yes, you lose the round trip efficiency of renewable power to hydrogen and back to electricity again. The round trip efficiency is very poor. But if you're needing to meet peak generation demand, it's probably not a bad thing. So we see the prospects of retiring some of our Long Island generation and repowering the rest of it to hydrogen to be another good use case.
Steve, any early response to the DOE's documents?
Well, I agree with Ben that using it for peak load and also for intermittency, right? The problems we all have dunkelflaute. There are going to be periods when you can't do renewable. We need to be prepared for those. So that's one of the cases for hydrogen that makes good sense, and we have to look at when and how to do that. I'm just going to say with the hubs, I think we have to think about these as the pilots, right? These are our learning experiences rather than as the lock-in. So this is where, again, and certainly I've been in conversations with DOE, we've got to measure the emissions associated with it. We've got to get the energy characteristics. We've got to make sure we collect lots of data from these hubs and learn and ensure that we then bring those lessons forward rather than treating these as a given that's going to move forward and expand. Some of them will hopefully be really successful and they're going to be the models for forward, and some others probably won't. And they will hopefully adopt enough of a range of strategies that will figure that out. But to see them really as a test bed, this is a way to get the learning so that we don't make mistakes. In the case of natural gas, and it's understandable why it happened, but we built a massive infrastructure, not thinking at all about these sort of integrated problems, and now we're trying to retrofit it, including the methane fee in the Inflation Reduction Act and increased regulation. We want to avoid that. We don't have the time to make those mistakes. We got to get it close to right from the beginning.
We had another question come in from a reporter who's asking the significance of the hydrogen provision in the proposed permitting bill, which would make hydrogen pipelines similar to interstate natural gas pipelines for purposes of permitting, meaning the permitting process primarily running through FERC. Do either of you have a comment on that at this time?
I mean, I think we support that, right? We'd be keen to see, we want to see all the tools in the toolbox, right? And if we go back to some of my opening remarks, we believe in choice, and we think ultimately the best way to achieve decarbonisation is to set the targets and then allow the market to decide how to make it. So if a hydrogen pipeline is prospective, to take, for example, hydrogen to some high-intensity heat industrial customer that needs a dedicated pipeline, then we ought to be removing barriers to allow that to be consented and permitted.
Steve?
Well, I'm a scientist. I'm going to pass on that in the sense that I haven't looked at the proposed bill. But again, one of the things we really need to do is we have no data on the integrity of hydrogen pipes. We really don't.
Right.
We know they're not blowing up, which is super important. We care about safety, but there's a big gap between being safe and being low emissions. We need that data before we, again, make massive investments.
Yeah, and I fully agree with you that when we think about building out those hydrogen hubs, using them, not just providing funding for observation, but using them as a test bed for how we develop really strong observational systems for the future, I think is an important task for any of the participants as well as the DOE to enforce. I want to thank you both for a lively and interesting discussion. I've learned quite a bit, and it's been really helpful as I'm thinking through how do we want to, what role do we see for hydrogen in the future energy system, right? Yogi Berra said that making predictions, it's really easy, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. I don't know that we know what role it's going to play, but the dynamics and the conversation and the contours we've investigated today are going to be things we're going to all hear about over the next few years. So I'm really grateful that you both provided your time, and I hope the audience benefited as much as I did. So please enjoy our virtual thanks. And to our audience, I really appreciate you joining us today. I did want to make note, if you're joining us here on the live stream, then tomorrow we invite you to join us for a second conversation. You'll like this, Steve. At 2 p.m. Eastern time here in the U.S., we're going to meet with the head of the International Methane Emissions Observatory for a conversation on methane emissions data and how it is enabling emissions reductions worldwide. I hope that you can join us for that conversation, and this is CSIS signing off.